A fine rain fell on Manhattan, like a silent veil, blurring reflections in the mirrored windows of the buildings. High up on Park Avenue, where the sidewalks were wide and the lights never went out, walked Elias Grant, a millionaire known more for his arrogance than his fortune. His hands were buried in the pockets of his expensive overcoat, and a crooked smile played on his face as he crossed the street, indifferent to the red light. His haste had nothing to do with urgent appointments or business, but rather with the brown envelope he held close to his body, as if it were a newly won trophy. Inside that envelope were documents he shouldn't have seen, much less touched. Personal information, bank records, addresses, correspondence, belongings of someone who didn't know they had been stolen. Elias had the strange habit of collecting things that didn't belong to him. He called it a game or human curiosity, a euphemism for discreetly stealing other people's lives in fragments. For him, returning them was part of the fun. He liked to ring doorbells, smile broadly, and say, as if it were just a noble gesture, "I'm just returning this envelope." That was the plan for the night, to return something that wasn't his, just to observe the victim's reaction, to feel the surge of power emanating from that charade. But that night, someone would be watching, someone to whom that envelope belonged, someone who wouldn't react with discomfort or surprise, but with the certainty that they had found the culprit. On the other side of town, in a much less lit neighborhood, Daniel Mercer descended the narrow stairs of his old building with heavy steps. He held in his hands a copy of a letter from his bank, informing him of strange transactions and requests he had never made. In recent months, his life had taken a disturbing turn. Unexpected notifications, bills he didn't recognize, people staring at him in the streets as if they knew him. He had lost sleep, convinced he was being watched. He had lost friends, because no one believed his growing paranoia, and he had also lost his patience. That afternoon, however, he had found something that confirmed his deepest suspicion. A security camera near his mailbox, belonging to the building next door, had recorded the exact moment when a man discreetly removed an envelope that Daniel had been expecting to receive for weeks. The image was clear enough to reveal a familiar face, not personally, but from magazines and headlines. Elias Grant. Daniel reviewed the recording dozens of times until he memorized the millionaire's satisfied smile as he looked at the envelope before walking away calmly. It wasn't paranoia. It was no coincidence. Someone was meddling in his life, and that someone was powerful, untouchable, accustomed to playing with what didn't belong to him. Now, with the night shrouded in clouds and the city breathing heavily, Daniel walked with his hood pulled down over his face, holding another printout, an improvised geolocation tracking of one of the requests made in his name, which curiously pointed to a curious area of the Upper East Side, near Elias's penthouse. With each step, his unease grew, but alongside it was a determination he had never felt before. It wasn't impulsiveness. It was the weight of a boundary crossed. Daniel didn't intend to confront Elias physically, not yet. First, he needed to understand what motivated that man. Why steal mail? Why meddle in the lives of ordinary people? And above all, why him? Meanwhile, Elias strolled carefree through the luxurious lobby of his building. He greeted the doorman with a lazy nod, ignoring the suspicious look of the young man who, weeks before, had found open envelopes in the trash and was beginning to suspect something. The elevator ascended silently, bringing with it a distorted reflection of the millionaire on the mirrored wall. Elias examined his own image with childlike pride. He had a fun night ahead of him. His destiny awaited him just a few blocks away. Daniel Mercer's apartment. He planned to return the envelope with the rehearsed phrase, "just returning," as if he were a good Samaritan, and observe, perhaps from the corner, the confusion etched on the victim's face. For him, it wasn't a crime. It was social art, an elegant, almost refined manipulation. But what Elijah didn't know was that Daniel was much closer than he imagined, and that, On that night, unlike the others, he wouldn't be the only one watching. The street was silent when Daniel saw Elias leave the building carrying the brown envelope. Tension gripped his chest, but his steps remained firm. He didn't have a complete plan, but he had the truth, and it burned inside him like a fuse about to ignite. And Elijah had something he shouldn't have had. The meeting between the two was not planned, but it was going to happen. And when it happened, nothing in either of their lives would remain the same. The following morning brought a pale light over Manhattan, revealing a stark contrast between the worlds of Elias Grant and Daniel Mercer. While the millionaire awoke in his sprawling penthouse, where every detail was designed to impress, from the polished concrete walls to the strategically placed artwork, Daniel emerged from his narrow bed in his small rented Harlem apartment, where the noise of the trains was so constant it had become part of the silence. However, nothing that morning would be ordinary for any of them. Elias drank his coffee, sitting at a long table, observing the city through the panoramic windows. He moved his little finger over the brown envelope he had returned the night before, remembering the almost euphoric feeling of having delivered it to Daniel's mailbox without being seen. But something bothered him, a shadow on the corner, perhaps a figure moving too fast. He dismissed the impression, attributing it to his habit of always being attentive to his own steps. However, as he stirred his coffee, the feeling that someone was watching him insisted on resurfacing, like a small crack in the pride he cultivated so well. But Elias wasn't used to being watched. He was used to watching. Daniel was walking through the busy streets with the envelope in his hands. He hadn't slept, not after witnessing with his own eyes the millionaire approaching his mailbox the night before. He didn't have a perfect image, but he was absolutely certain. Elias was playing a trick on him, and this wasn't just a personal annoyance. It was a profound, almost intimate invasion, as if someone had stuck their hands into his life and rummaged through everything. On his way to work, Daniel stopped in front of a busy coffee shop. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread made him hesitate, but he didn't go in. Instead, he observed the customers through the glass. Families, office workers, young students, all living predictable routines, protected by the belief that their privacy was guaranteed. Daniel had lost that illusion weeks ago. Now he felt as if every movement was being watched, every word recorded, every mistake analyzed. The city, once welcoming, now seemed like a network of invisible eyes. Elias, for his part, lived precisely on that feeling, that of being able to peek through the cracks in other people's lives. He wasn't a thief, nor did he need to be. His money had opened doors to powerful circles where he was respected, or at least feared. However, his entertainment was never in wealth, but in what he did with it, testing social boundaries, manipulating small situations, observing reactions. It was as if others existed only so that he could better understand human nature, an elegant justification for profoundly selfish behavior. That day, however, his curiosity would lead him to something bigger than he had planned. As Elias walked through the streets of the Upper East Side, he passed people who recognized him from magazines and interviews. He greeted some with the same rehearsed friendliness, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered the feeling of being watched the night before. It bothered him more than he admitted. He was the predator, not the prey. Meanwhile, Daniel, during his shift as a maintenance technician at a small law firm, struggled with growing anxiety. With each phone call, with each digital file he handled, he wondered if someone else might also have access to it. The paranoia, which had previously seemed exaggerated, now had a form and a name. And this certainty kept him on high alert. But what began to change the dynamics of the game was a third element: the city itself. New York was in a tense moment. Newspaper headlines spoke of identity theft, sophisticated scams, and digital intrusions. The feeling that no one was truly safe hung in the air. And ironically, it was this climate that allowed Elias to act undetected. People were already used to distrusting everything except someone with so much prestige. It wasn't until late afternoon that Daniel noticed something curious. While rummaging through his toolbox, he found a folded piece of paper inside, a short note without any identifying information. "Not everything is as you think." And below, a small arrow is drawn, pointing backwards. Daniel turned around immediately, but the hallway was empty. Too empty. That note wasn't from Elias. He had a different style, a different signature. Someone else was involved. Night fell again over New York, with the same unease that had marked the day. But unlike the previous evening, this time Daniel walked with a more defined purpose. The presence of the note found in his toolbox simmered in his mind. It wasn't Elias's style. The millionaire liked theatricality, irony, phrases that showed his mastery. The short, almost enigmatic message pointed to another person, someone who knew what was happening, someone who might have been watching them both. Daniel tucked the note into his coat pocket and headed home, his gaze fixed on every step behind him. There was unusual activity in the streets. Distant sirens, cars speeding by, people glancing over their shoulders. Perhaps he was more sensitive. Perhaps he was finally seeing things he had previously ignored. But one certainty settled in. He wasn't the only one interested in that envelope. On the other side of town, Elias was leaving a meeting at a private restaurant. His investors were pressing him for quick decisions, but he had barely heard half of what they said. His mind was preoccupied with the feeling of being followed. Not just watched, followed. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he couldn't immediately name: vulnerability. Crossing the street, Elias caught a brief glimpse in a shop window, a figure behind him, standing on the other side of the sidewalk. He turned immediately, but there was no one there. Or rather, there was just ordinary people walking hurriedly, oblivious to his presence. The instinct, however, didn't disappear. Someone was monitoring his every move, and that deeply troubled him. For a man accustomed to controlling everything around him, the feeling was unbearable. That same night, Daniel entered his apartment and found the door ajar. His stomach clenched. He didn't usually forget to lock doors, especially now that he lived in constant alert. With silent steps, he entered the apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the brown envelope which had previously been stored in the drawer and was now on the table. And next to it, another note. "You don't understand what you have in your hands." Daniel's heart beat faster. He felt exposed, invaded, overwhelmed by frustration and anger. It wasn't just Elias. It wasn't just a game. Someone had an interest in that content. An interest far beyond the millionaire's curiosity. For the first time, Daniel carefully opened the envelope, examining each piece of paper. The information was sensitive, personal, but nothing seemed to justify so much interest. Until he found, at the bottom, a tiny memory card, thin as a blade. He didn't remember seeing it before. Perhaps Elias had placed it there without realizing it, or perhaps it was part of the original contents that he hadn't yet checked. Connect the card to the computer. A single file appeared, a password-protected document. His body went cold. If someone wanted that envelope so badly, it wasn't because of the papers, it was because of what was hidden inside. While Daniel was unsuccessfully trying to open the file, Elias arrived at his apartment. He threw his coat on the sofa and poured himself a whiskey, trying to shake off the feeling of being surrounded. But then, as he turned off the living room lights, he noticed a reflection in the window pane. Someone in the building across the street, in the dark window, looking in his direction. Elias froze. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't paranoia. Someone was definitely watching. He picked up the phone and, for the first time, considered calling the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. How could he explain what was happening without exposing his peculiar hobby? How could he justify the envelope? The last thing he wanted was a formal investigation. But the decision was no longer his. 2 minutes later, his phone vibrated with an anonymous message. "You've gone too far this time. and below, a photo of himself, 2 hours earlier, leaving the restaurant and looking over his shoulder. The photo could only have been taken by someone who was very, very close. While Elias stared at the screen with a trembling hand, Daniel finally managed to open a small preview of the encrypted file. Just a fragment, but enough to realize that it had nothing to do with his personal life. It was something much bigger: names, values, dates, and a draft report involving money laundering by a highly well-known public figure. And, ironically, it wasn't Elijah. He was someone even more powerful. Now, three forces were in motion. Daniel, trying to understand why he had been dragged into this. Elias, battling a fear he had never experienced before. And a third individual, silent, who knew exactly what he was looking for and was willing to do anything to get it back. The tension between them was beginning to tighten, like three lines intersecting at an inevitable point, and that point was very close. The following hours became unstable ground, where the three characters, Elias, Daniel, and the unknown observer, walked without knowing what the other would do. And, as the main conflict grew, other narrative threads emerged, weaving unexpected connections that further increased the pressure on everyone. The first of these leads came when Daniel decided to seek out Laura, a co-worker who had always been suspicious of the irregularities he reported. Laura was meticulous, intelligent, and had an almost infallible instinct for fraud. Although she hadn't fully believed Daniel's paranoia in the past, recent media reports about cybercrimes made her more receptive than ever. When Daniel approached her, she realized that something about him had changed. He didn't just seem worried, he seemed persecuted. "Are you sure it's not just a bank error?" she asked, while examining some statements that Daniel was bringing. "It's not a mistake." "And it's not just the bank either," Daniel replied, hesitating about how much he could reveal. He needed help, but he also knew that involving Laura could put her at risk. Still, she was his only possible ally. Meanwhile, a second subplot unfolded in Elias's world. He had quietly fired one of his personal bodyguards, Reed Malloy, weeks earlier. Reed was efficient, but had a habit of asking too many questions. The millionaire didn't like that. What Elias didn't know was that Reed had become deeply resentful about being fired, and that, coincidentally, he now worked for a private security firm that provided services to powerful people, including the same name listed in the encrypted file found by Daniel. Reed's resentment was mixed with a distorted sense of justice. He always knew Elias was hiding things, but he never imagined the millionaire could get involved in something truly dangerous. When he discovered that Elias had an envelope containing information linked to a federal-level financial scandal, Reed saw an opportunity he wasn't willing to miss to prove he'd always been right about his old boss and profit from it. That was the identity of the silent observer. A third layer of complexity emerged when Laura, investigating on her own, discovered that several employees at Daniel's bank had recently been dismissed for data manipulation. Apparently, someone within the agency had facilitated access to his personal information, and this discovery connected Daniel's case to something much larger than mail hacking. He had been chosen as a target to cover up far broader irregularities. While Laura gathered data, Daniel tried to cope with the mounting pressure. The lights in his apartment began to flicker on subsequent nights. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, at improbable hours, became more frequent. He felt increasingly that the net was closing in, but he didn't want to run. He wanted answers. Meanwhile, Elias received another unidentified message. This time, it was a short video recorded from afar. Daniel observing the building where Elias lived. The millionaire paled. From the perspective of someone who didn't know the truth, it seemed like obsession. It seemed like persecution. What he didn't realize was that Daniel was simply trying to protect his own life. The main conflict was beginning to get entangled with these subplots. Laura discovering the inside job at the bank. Reed is investigating Elias and wants to profit from it. The encrypted file reveals dangerous financial connections. Daniel being watched and used as a scapegoat. Elias fearing that Daniel was a psychopath after him, when in fact it was he himself who had initiated the entire chain of events. The time pressure was intensifying. At the end of a particularly tense night, Laura called Daniel urgently. "Daniel, you need to come here now." Her voice was steady, but there was something about it that made it clear she had found something too big. Daniel rushed to the location. Upon entering the office, he found Laura in front of a screen filled with names, accounts, suspicious transactions, and, among them, a detail that made his stomach sink. His own name was associated with an illegal, high-value transfer that he never made. He was officially implicated in the scheme. Laura looked at him with astonishment and fear. "Someone is using you, Daniel. And if this gets out, you could be arrested." Meanwhile, at that very moment, Reed Malloy was compiling a folder with everything he had collected on Elias, including photos, financial information, and screenshots of anonymous messages. He was ready to make his move, not for the sake of justice, but for revenge. The subplots weren't just connecting, they were preparing to collide at the same point, and that point was getting closer and closer to exploding. The revelation of the envelope not only triggered a central conflict, it opened fissures that spread to everyone around Ethan, connecting parallel stories that, until then, seemed independent. While the millionaire believed he was only dealing with a case of someone trying to embarrass him, the truth was much more complex. Each person orbiting his life carried their own reckoning with lies, fear, and power. One of the subplots emerged with the strained relationship between Ethan and his assistant Claire. Discreet and meticulous, she was always responsible for correcting the flaws that Ethan preferred to ignore. Behind the scenes, she was the one who put out fires, delayed documents, promises Ethan made to important donors and forgot, invitations rejected without explanation. When the envelope arrived, Claire noticed something on his face that she hadn't seen in years: genuine insecurity. And for the first time, she hesitated to help him. There was a hidden tension there. Claire was tired of being the shadow that supported his brilliance. Secretly, she had begun sending resumes to competing companies. The envelope, to her, was a symbol of what Ethan had always avoided, facing the real impact of his own actions. Another subplot revolved around journalist Mark Rowland, who had been trying for months to publish an investigation into the manipulation of public contracts involving companies that Ethan financed. Nothing proved the millionaire's direct involvement, but Mark believed there was something deeper, and now, with rumors about a mysterious envelope circulating in the private circles of Ethan's campaign, his journalistic instincts kicked in. Mark didn't know who had sent the envelope, but he began to trace every detail of the party scene: photos posted on guests' social media, deleted stories, incomplete testimonials. He realized that the existence of an unforgettable envelope, never officially mentioned, meant that someone important was hiding something. The newspaper he worked for didn't want to pick a fight. He did. The third subplot emerged silently, almost invisibly, but fundamentally, the true owner of the envelope, identified only as the observer. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't Ethan's employee. He wasn't even someone the millionaire would recognize if he crossed paths with him on the street. But he saw everything at the party. He observed the way Ethan held the envelope, how he laughed, how he treated the contents as something trivial. According to Observador, that was insulting. He wasn't after money, he was after righteousness. Every detail of the plan was calculated, and Ethan had just accelerated the process by underestimating the importance of something that didn't belong to him. Now, the observer has begun to leave deliberate traces: small notes, anonymous messages sent to strategic individuals, encrypted files containing indirect references to the envelope. Nothing explicit enough to be considered a threat. Everything subtle enough to generate paranoia. There's also a complex fourth layer involving Ethan's family. His eldest son, Lucas, was the most level-headed person in the house, and also the one who resented his father's public behavior the most. After the party, he realized that the family's security had been reinforced without explanation. Additional guards, altered routes, switched cell phones. When questioned, Ethan dodged the question. This only made things worse. Lucas decided to find out the reason on his own, and in doing so, he found disconnected clues. A name that appeared in access logs, altered phone call times, deleted messages. Unbeknownst to him, he was getting closer to the trail left by the observer. These subplots began to intertwine with the main conflict, creating shadows that Ethan couldn't control. People who had previously orbited around him were now following their own paths, and each of them, Claire, Mark, the Watcher, Lucas, carried a different piece of the puzzle. The environment, which had previously seemed orderly, was now driven by invisible tensions, loyalty eroding, the search for truth intensifying, and fear spreading silently without a defined face. And Ethan, at the center of it all, continued to believe that he was still in control. The tension surrounding Ethan began to grow so dense that it could no longer be ignored. The millionaire was fully aware that something was amiss, but his natural reaction, trying to regain control by force, was beginning to have unintended consequences. He had always been a man accustomed to shaping public narratives. Now he faced a narrative he had neither written nor understood. The first crack appeared during a meeting with his finance committee. He noticed whispers, glances exchanged, phones being hidden as soon as he entered the room. The news about the envelope had spread underground, like a vague but menacing rumor. Ethan demanded explanations. He received none. For the first time in years, his authority was not enough to break the silence. Meanwhile, the observer, always one step ahead, intensified his psychological game. He sent Claire an encrypted, unsigned email containing only one sentence. He knows what he was trying to hide. It didn't mention names, dates, places, nothing that was directly incriminating. But it was enough to make Claire feel the weight of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding at the party. And unlike Ethan, she didn't dismiss the signal. She kept the message, and he began to connect what he knew with what he feared. Lucas was also getting dangerously close to the truth. By insisting on understanding why the family's routine had changed, he gained access to an internal security recording from the night of the party. A side camera, ignored by the security guards, captured part of the scene in the hall. Ethan, with the envelope in his hands, and someone in the background, standing motionless, observing everything attentively. An ordinary face, but tough, a fixed gaze, as if analyzing every detail. Lucas paused the image dozens of times. He felt something instinctive. That person wasn't there by chance. The second wave of the escalation began when journalist Mark Rowland published a seemingly innocuous piece, a short, almost unassuming article about the culture of secrecy among philanthropic elites. But in the penultimate paragraph, one sentence sparked national attention. And among so many secrets, there are rumors of an envelope that changed hands at last month's charity gala, a simple object, but one closely watched by its rightful owner. The text didn't mention Ethan. It didn't directly mention the event, and yet everyone knew. His name exploded as a trending topic within hours. Ethan called an emergency meeting with his communications team. The order was clear: suppress, deny, deflect. But for the first time, no one came up with solid solutions. It was as if they were fighting something they didn't know where it began, a shadow moving too fast. It was in this climate that a second movement by the observer took place. This time, he left something physical, an envelope identical to the one from the party, placed on the meeting table at Ethan's house. No note, no contents, just his presence. The impact was devastating. Security had been reinforced, routes changed, guards doubled, and yet someone still got in. Ethan exploded. "Who is allowing this?" The entire team fell silent. His power, once indisputable, now seemed to slip through his fingers. As chaos spread, Claire made a decision. She secretly sought out Lucas. Her goal wasn't to betray Ethan, but to protect herself. She told him that she had received an anonymous message and that she believed it was all connected to something Ethan had never publicly admitted. Lucas, already suspicious, asked to see the message, and when she read the sentence, "He knows what he tried to hide," she felt an instant chill. That threat wasn't generic. It had a target. It had a purpose. Mark, in turn, discovered an unexpected witness, a staff member from the party's catering service who remembered a tall, calm man who had discreetly asked who would be responsible for the lost items. Mark followed this clue and found a name: Adam Rowe. No clear record, no significant online presence. But one thing caught his attention. That name appeared as a visitor at a government building during the same period that Ethan was attending closed meetings. Coincidence? Mark doubted it. The escalation reached a new level when Lucas decided to confront his father, even if indirectly. He gathered the images, Claire's story, the envelope left at the house, and asked, "Dad, what are you hiding?" Ethan froze. He had an endless list of things he should never have to explain to anyone, but only one thing truly terrified him: the fact that someone, a stranger, not only had the original envelope, but was now slowly surrounding it with almost surgical precision. He simply replied, "Nothing you need to know." It was precisely this answer that convinced Lucas that he needed to find out everything before it was too late. The pressure was so high that even the most loyal employees began to hesitate. Some asked to be removed from their positions. Others simply disappeared without warning. Ethan, who had always controlled everything, companies, events, people, narratives, now controlled less and less, and it was visible. The observer knew this, and he intensified the siege. On a cold Wednesday morning, Claire found a third envelope on the back seat of the car. Inside, someone had left a single printed photograph. Lucas chatting with Mark Rowland in a cafe the previous evening. The angle was distant, but clearly intentional. The message was implicit. "I see all of you. I know where you are. I know who you're talking to." Claire panicked, and this time the panic was so real she could barely breathe. He didn't ask Lucas if he had met with the journalist. He didn't call Mark to ask for explanations. She simply ran home, locked herself in her room, and began to cry silently. It wasn't about an envelope anymore. It was persecution, and worse, harassment from someone with unlimited access. When Ethan saw the photo, he couldn't hide the trembling in his hands. Not because of an external threat, but that meant Lucas was involved, even without understanding what was at stake. The millionaire tried to react in the way he always reacted, using force, money, and influence. He hired a new private security group, specialists in digital surveillance. He decided that all the family's cell phones would be replaced. He suspended public engagements. He turned the house into a bunker, but the observer simply adapted. 2 days later, Mark received an anonymous package at his office. Inside it, there was an audio recording. The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. He stole something that didn't belong to him. You're looking for the right story. Keep following. Mark, for the first time in his entire career, felt genuine fear. Up until that point, the journalist believed he was dealing with a corporate scandal, but that recording had a different energy, another intention. It was personal, deep, free. The escalation reached its peak when Lucas realized he was being followed by a black car, always the same one, always at the same distance. It didn't matter if he changed course, sped up, or drove around in circles. The car always reappeared. And one night, when he parked in front of the condominium, the car's lights went out, but the car remained there, parked, watching. The young man entered the house with his heart racing. He looked for Claire. He told everything. She immediately confirmed that she too had been receiving signs, indirect messages, small details out of place. That's when the two of them made a decision that would change everything. They would look for this Adam Rowe on their own. Sem Ethan, no security, no press, not for the truth itself, but because they both felt that if they didn't quickly discover who the observer was, something terrible could happen. And very soon, the dramatic escalation was complete. The partial tensions became intertwined. The threats have become more concrete, and the feeling of being surrounded, previously only psychological, was now physical, inescapable. The board was set up. All the pieces are in place. The final confrontation between Ethan's secrets and the shadowy presence of the Watcher was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Ethan's house no longer felt like a home, but rather a makeshift barracks. Guards patrolled the hallways, new doors had been installed, and cameras flashed in almost every corner. Even so, the dominant feeling wasn't security, it was vulnerability. Every step echoed as if someone, somewhere, was listening intently. The first major consequence of the escalation came when Ethan's company, Carter Holdings, suffered an internal leak. Documents that were supposed to be confidential appeared on the internet overnight. Nothing explosive, but enough to suggest that someone with privileged access was sending messages. The directors demanded explanations. Investors called every hour. The press smelled blood. Ethan, for the first time in many years, was cornered. Meanwhile, Lucas and Claire tried to act more discreetly. They had decided to look for any information about Adam Rowe, but they hadn't told Ethan. With each new discovery, they became more convinced that they were dealing with someone extremely meticulous. They found out that Adam had worked in smaller government agencies, always in positions that required observation, information gathering, and absolute discretion. Something about him didn't make sense. All his appearances were too short, as if he were constantly on the move, always chasing something or someone. But the biggest consequence of all came on a quiet night when Lucas entered Ethan's office to pick up a charger. On the table, there was a safe that was ajar. He shouldn't have looked, but he looked. Inside were clippings from old newspapers, old documents, and in the center, a yellowed envelope, original, worn by time, similar to the one Ethan had returned at the party. Lucas didn't touch it, didn't open it, but that was enough to completely shatter his trust. His father had lied, not just omitted, he had lied outright, and if he was hiding the original envelope, then which one had the observer shown? A copy? A warning? Or is it proof of something still unknown? When Claire found Lucas sitting on the hallway floor, pale and breathless, he couldn't hide it. He told her everything. She felt her stomach churn, not because of the discovery itself, but because everything was clear in a terrifying way. The observer didn't want to hurt them. He wanted to expose Ethan. And each of their actions, without realizing it, was helping the pursuer get closer to their goal. On the other side of town, Mark Rowland was also facing consequences. The journalist began to notice that his computer was being accessed remotely. Folders disappeared and reappeared. Files were renamed. The newspaper, concerned about legal liability, temporarily suspended its investigation. But Mark didn't stop. The recording he received tormented him. The distorted voice repeated in his mind, he stole something that didn't belong to him. What did he steal? From who? And why? Mark knew the answer lay in Ethan's past, a past that had likely never been publicly examined. The more he investigated, the more he realized Ethan had a double life, not criminal, but deeply political and strategic. Always orbiting influential people, silent favors, undocumented deals. And one of those agreements had clearly gotten out of control. As tensions rose on all sides, Ethan reacted in the only way he knew how, by withdrawing even further. He fired employees he considered untrustworthy. He ordered all the computers in the house to be checked. It strengthened security. He tried to buy the silence of small media outlets that were hinting at criticism, but the Observer always got there first. Each step Ethan took seemed only to encourage him to move forward further. The emotional impact on the family was devastating. Claire slept badly. Lucas was starting to have constant anxiety attacks. Ethan, despite trying to maintain control, had become a paranoid figure, distrusting even his own shadow. The last straw came when Lucas, leaving home to go to college, found yet another envelope stuck under the car's windshield wiper. Inside, just one handwritten sentence: "Are you ready to find out what he did?" Lucas felt something break open inside him. It wasn't fear anymore. It was determination. He returned home immediately. He looked for Claire. He said they couldn't back down any further. The Observer was orchestrating everything, but they still had a chance to uncover the truth before the situation spiraled completely out of control. And while they were planning their next step, something unexpected happened. The home security system triggered itself. Alarms sounded. The doors locked automatically. Guards ran through the corridors. In the main room, in the center of the table where Ethan used to hold important meetings, there was now a fifth envelope, left there despite all the security measures. On the back, a single word written with precision: tomorrow. It was no longer a threat. It was an advertisement. The Observer was about to act, and the impact would be far greater than any of them imagined. The night after the envelope marked "tomorrow" appeared was the longest night of Lucas, Claire, and Ethan's lives. Each dealt with the tension differently, but all felt with the same intensity that something irreversible was about to happen. And it was precisely this feeling that triggered the first step towards the inevitable growth of the characters. Lucas, from hesitation to confrontation. In the silent early morning, Lucas realized he could no longer continue as he had been, hiding behind the decisions of others, waiting for someone to solve everything for him, running away from conflicts that demanded action. The persecution, the fear, the psychological siege, all of it pushed him to the realization that if he didn't take control of his own life, he would be crushed by Ethan's choices, the Observer's plan, and the growing manipulation around him. It was then that he made a decision that would mark his first major transformation: to confront his father's past without waiting for permission. He sat down at the computer, opened old files, sifted through invoices, searched for public records. His reasoning was sharper than ever, a result of the pressure, the anxiety, the need to survive. He found repeated names, coinciding dates, and trips that Ethan had taken during the exact same periods that Adam Rowe was working for federal agencies. And one thing became clear: Ethan and Adam knew each other for many years. Lucas felt the weight of the revelation. But unlike previous nights, he did not freeze. He didn't hide. He acted. Claire. From dependence to courage. Claire had always been in the shadow of Ethan's life, not out of submission, but out of habit. He made grand decisions, solved money problems, moved mountains with his influence. Over the years, she came to believe that she didn't need to get deeply involved, that her role was to maintain peace on the surface, not to start underground wars. But now everything was falling apart. When she realized that her own safety was being manipulated by a stranger, that her life had become a vulnerable showcase, and that Lucas, almost like a son, was at the center of the storm, something broke inside her. Or perhaps it had finally been fixed. Claire decided to protect Lucas not only emotionally, but actively. It was she who suggested they go downtown to interview a witness mentioned by Mark Rowland, a retired employee who had worked at one of the agencies where Adam had been employed. She was the one who insisted on going in person, even knowing that she might be being watched. She was the one who faced the man and asked without trembling, "Please tell us who Adam Rowe was to Ethan Carter." Her courage was not impulsive. It was being built. It was a direct result of everything he had lost, everything he feared, and above all, the need to protect someone the millionaire couldn't protect. Ethan, from absolute control to recognizing his own fragility, the man who had always commanded rooms, negotiated with giants, and manipulated narratives, now faced something he never imagined he would have to confront, the truth arriving from both the outside and the inside at the same time. The appearance of the envelope labeled "Tomorrow" didn't infuriate him. It left him speechless, and for the first time since the beginning of it all, Ethan allowed himself to admit it to himself. He no longer had control, not because of the situation, not from your image, not from their own family, and this admission, while devastating, opened the door for another kind of growth, that of someone who needs to stop running away. In his library, surrounded by memories, clippings, and documents hidden for decades, Ethan finally tried to understand why the Observer wanted to expose everything. He read every old document, every record, every detail, and he noticed something he had never consciously considered before. He had built his life on small injustices, and one of them had deeply wounded Adam. It wasn't a major crime, nor something that would attract the attention of the justice system. It was worse. It was a moral issue, human, guys. Ethan realized that the real danger wasn't the Watcher, it was himself, and his inability to deal with the past. The intermediate revelation. On the morning of tomorrow, Lucas and Claire returned from their visit to the former government employee with information that completely changed how they saw everything. Adam Rowe had been Ethan's mentor years before he became a millionaire. Not an enemy, not a rival, not a victim, mentor. And Ethan had left him behind when greater opportunities arose, not explicitly, but in a cold, calculated, and deeply ungrateful way. Adam had been erased from Ethan's history, literally removed from photos, ignored in interviews, forgotten in public. For Lucas and Claire, the penny dropped. The Observer did not want to destroy Ethan. I wanted him to face the truth about who he really was. And this understanding is what fueled the characters' final transformation. They stopped being victims of a game and began to see themselves as agents capable of changing the course of events. Emotional preparation for the climax. On the eve of the inevitable encounter with Adam, or with what he planned, each member of the Carter family underwent a transformation. Lucas decided he would confront his father and the Observer if necessary. Claire decided she would never again let anyone silently dictate her life. Ethan decided he needed to stop running and start taking responsibility. There was no escape anymore, no excuses, not even walls. There was only evolution, forced by circumstances, shaped by fear, and solidified by responsibility. The stage was set for the confrontation, not just physically, but emotionally. The air was heavy that night. Dark clouds covered the New York sky like a dark curtain, and the lights from the buildings reflected in the puddles of rain that were beginning to form. At the top of the Hale Tower, millionaire Richard Hale watched the city with his hands resting on the glass railing. He was waiting for this, for the truth, for the confrontation that had been building since the day that stranger appeared, just returning an envelope. The helicopter landed on the adjacent helipad, and the strong wind pushed the rain against the glass, as if the city itself anticipated the impact of what was to come. The door opened, and Ethan Ward stepped out, his face tense, his gaze fixed on the millionaire he had challenged and deceived for weeks. Among them, finally, would come the ultimate revelation. Who was lying? Who was the true owner of all this? Hale turned slowly, with the cold smile that Ethan had learned to hate. "So you came," he said, finally. Ethan maintained a steady expression, despite his racing heart. "I came because everything ends today." Hale raised his eyebrows. "Everything? No, Ethan, just today. It ends." The tension cut through the air like a blade. But Ethan didn't back down. On the contrary, he took 2 steps forward. "You stole what wasn't yours," he stated, "and you thought you could get away with it because you had money, lawyers, private security. But the rightful owner of all this isn't you." Hale laughed, that same laugh from the first scene, when he received just an envelope, and laughed as if he were facing an idiot. "I'm the owner," he said. "I always have been." But before Hale could continue, the door to the inner access to the helipad slammed open. Claire, Hale's daughter, entered completely soaked, her breath short, her face marked by a determination that no one expected. "Dad, don't lie anymore," she said. Richard turned around, annoyed, almost frightened. "Claire, this is none of your business. Go inside, now." But she didn't obey. "I read the documents, Dad. All of them." Her voice trembled, but she kept her gaze steady. "You knew from the beginning that my grandfather never sold Ward Industries. You took everything after he died, manipulated the board, forged signatures, and ousted the only legitimate heir." A deafening silence fell over the helipad. The rain pounded harder and harder, as if marking the rhythm of the moment. Hale slowly turned his face towards Ethan. "You poisoned my daughter against me." Ethan shook his head. "No, she figured it out on her own. I only revealed why I never left." Hale took a step forward angrily. "You came into my life pretending to be just another messenger. I came in with an envelope containing the first piece of evidence of your crime, and you laughed," Ethan replied. "You laughed because you thought no one could take you down." Claire positioned herself between the two. "Dad, please, stop. It's done. The council received the evidence this afternoon. The prosecutor did too. There's no going back now." Hale stood motionless. For a moment, he seemed smaller, like a giant finally realizing he could fall. But then, something inside it broke. He pulled out a gun. Claire screamed. Ethan stiffened. The rain seemed to fall faster. "No one will take everything from me," Hale roared. The next moment was pure chaos. Ethan threw himself in front of Claire. A gunshot rang out. The glass of the parapet cracked on impact. The city below remained indifferent, like a silent witness. Hale staggered back as Ethan attacked him by surprise. The gun slid across the wet ground. They rolled too close to the edge. It was too dangerous, but neither of them would back down now. Ethan finally pinned him to the floor, holding his arms down. "It's over," he shouted. Hale was still fighting, spitting out rage. "You don't deserve anything, nothing. That old idiot should never have left everything in your family's hands, and you should never have taken everything from her," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with years of accumulated pain. "You destroyed lives. Today, that ends." Claire picked up the fallen gun, not to use it, but to push it away. She wiped a tear from her face with her free hand. "Dad," she whispered, "I still love you. But I can't save you from this." That was the final fall. Richard Hale stopped fighting. His whole body seemed to lose strength. He looked at his daughter not with hatred, but with something close to regret. Perhaps not enough to repair the past, but real enough to break down any defenses. The sirens of the police cars started to sound down below. Police helicopters were approaching. The millionaire's world was crumbling, and there was nothing more he could do. Ethan stood up slowly, exhausted, the rain streaming down his face, his chest heaving. Claire held his arm. "You did it," she said. "My grandfather would be proud." He looked at her with a gentle expression. "He deserves justice, and you deserve the truth." The helipad door opened again, and agents surrounded Hale. He didn't resist, only raised his hands in defeat. As he was being led away, he looked at Ethan one last time. There was no hatred, just the inevitable realization that the game was over. Ethan stood there watching the police leave with Hale. The wind died down, the rain began to stop, as if the storm had been necessary to wash away the remnants of an era of lies. Claire approached. "Now the rest begins," she said, and Ethan finally believed. The climax was over. But the real reconstruction was only just beginning. The sun timidly rose behind the skyscrapers as Ethan Ward re-entered the building that had once belonged to his grandfather. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of injustice as he walked through the immense marble lobby. That morning represented something he thought he would never achieve: the beginning of a new era. Ward Industries, after years under Richard Hale's control, was finally being returned to its rightful heir. Newspapers ran devastating headlines: "Millionaire Richard Hale arrested for corporate fraud and forgery." "Board confirms Hale took control of the company illegally." Ethan walked down the hallways accompanied by Claire, who, although shaken, seemed determined to rebuild her own path, far from her father's shadow. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, watching the main door of the principal's office. Ethan took a deep breath. "I've waited for this my whole life." But to be honest, it still feels surreal. The room was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood, when his grandfather brought him there, showing him the future that would one day be his. Hale had changed the furniture, the decor, the symbols, but now everything would be restored. Claire approached the large window that overlooked the city. "Ethan, I want you to know that. I'm so sorry for what my father did. I had no idea until I started putting the clues together." He gently touched her arm. "You're not to blame. On the contrary, without you, I wouldn't have made it to the end of this." She smiled, still fragile but honest. Meanwhile, outside, journalists gathered, waiting for an official statement. The company board waited downstairs to conduct the transition ceremony, but before facing the world, Ethan needed a moment to himself, a symbolic instant. He went to the old drawer where, years ago, his grandfather kept letters, children's drawings and mementos. Almost as if fate had orchestrated this scene, he found an envelope, yellowed with age, the same type of envelope with which it had all begun. Inside was a letter from his grandfather. "If you are reading this, it means that the truth has one day found its way to you. No matter how much they try to take from you, blood, honor, and courage cannot be stolen. Ward Industries is yours, not because my name is on the documents, but because you carry the values that created it." Ethan closed the letter, holding back his emotion. It was the final validation he didn't even know he needed. Claire approached, realizing the weight of the moment. "He always believed in you." "Yes, and now I can honor that." She looked at him with a soft glint in her eyes. "And you don't have to do it alone." The silence that followed was full of meaning. It wasn't just a business partnership, nor just complicity. It was something that had been born between the two during the chaos, and now had room to flourish without fear. Hours later, Ethan entered the company's main auditorium. Employees, advisors, and journalists waited anxiously. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience fell completely silent. "My name is Ethan Ward," he began, "and I'm here to reclaim the broken history and rebuild what should belong to all of us." He spoke about justice, about truth, about how power without responsibility destroys lives. He spoke about the mistakes of the past and about the future he intended to build, not alone, but with the entire company. With each word, it was possible to feel the weight of the last few weeks draining away. In the end, he concluded, "My grandfather believed that Ward Industries stood for integrity. I want to bring that back to the company name, and to my own name as well." The audience rose to their feet in applause. Claire, watching from the side of the stage, let out a smile that mixed pride, relief, and something deeper. When it was all over, she approached. "You were amazing." I tried to do what he would do. "No," she said, touching his hand. "You did it your way, and that's why it's going to work." He intertwined his fingers with hers. "Are you sure you want to stay here after all this?" "I want to help fix what my father destroyed," she replied. "It's the least I can do." Together, they walked down the brightly lit hallway of the building that now belonged to the Ward family again, and which, in some way, was also beginning to become a part of their history. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, and for the first time in many years, Ethan felt that the world was exactly where it should be. The beginning, not the end. The afternoon was slowly fading over Manhattan when Ethan finally managed a moment of silence in his new yet ancestral office. The ceremony, the interviews, the greetings, everything had been intense, almost overwhelming. The weight of his newfound responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel oppressive. It was a weight that I chose to load. Ward Industries, for decades deformed by the ambitious hands of Richard Hale, was now beginning its restoration process. Audits were underway, departments would undergo restructuring, and contracts would be renegotiated. But the most important thing had already been done. The truth had been exposed. The man who had taken everything from him was now answering for his actions. Justice was not usually swift, but in this case, it had been certain. Ethan watched the city below. The traffic flowing, people crossing the streets, lives following their own rhythms. It was curious to think that while he spent years trying to survive the weight of loss, the world kept turning, oblivious to the silent injustice that consumed it. Now, finally, he felt he could keep up with that movement, perhaps even lead it. The door opened slowly. Claire appeared, holding some folders, but with a more gentle than professional look. "It looks like he's finally breathing again," she said. "A little," he smiled wearily. "It was a long day." She went inside, closed the door behind her, and walked to the table. "The council approved your proposal to review the community projects. They said that this perfectly illustrates the difference between you and my father." Ethan looked up, surprised by the sincerity of the statement. "I just want this company to go back to doing what it should have done from the start." "And it will," Claire said, "because now it's in the right hands." A brief silence settled. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with everything the two had experienced together: mistrust, discovery, shock, revelations, courage. And despite everything, there they were, side by side, after the truth had destroyed what remained of the lies that surrounded them. "Claire," Ethan began, leaning on the table, "have you decided what you're going to do from now on?" She lowered her eyes for a moment. "I want to stay. Not to hide the surname I carry, but to build a new meaning for it." He smiled genuinely. "I would be happy if you did it here, with me." She returned the smile, and for the first time since the nightmare began, there was peace in her eyes. Outside, the city lights were turning on one by one, as if celebrating a new beginning. Ethan picked up the old envelope, the same one he'd found in the drawer, and carefully placed it in a new, light-colored wooden box. He was decided. The past would remain there as a reminder, but not as a shadow. When Claire extended her hand to him, he took it without hesitation. "Shall we go?" she asked. "Let's go," he replied. They left the office together, ready to face whatever lay ahead, because finally it was their future that was beginning. Months later, Ward Industries was once again a benchmark of integrity. Social projects flourished, ethical agreements replaced past transgressions, and the Ward family name regained its lost respect. Ethan, now secure in his position, walked through the lobby when he saw Claire coordinating a team, confident, serene, transformed. They exchanged a quick, knowing glance laden with everything they had survived together. High atop the building, the restored antique sign gleamed in the sun. Ward Industries, founded on truth. And for the first time, it wasn't just a slogan. It was real. If this story moved you, whether through the search for justice, the removal of masks, or the strength to start over, share it with someone who also deserves to feel this impact. Stories come alive when they circulate, when they spark debate, when they inspire others to confront their own truths. Comment, discuss, recommend. The story of Ethan and Claire may have come to an end, but the reflections it provokes continue. Who knows? Maybe the next surprising twist will come precisely from your reading.